Establishing central control opens lines for rapid development and potential kingside expansion. Embracing flexibility, this knight immediately prepares to contest central influence and support potential pawn advances later. Asserting central dominion, white immediately challenges the knight's scope and opens diagonals for queen and bishop. Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, preparing a solid central pawn structure. Developing the knight to its most natural square, this piece prepares to contest central squares and potentially support a pawn push. Instantly challenging the center, black aims to break open the pawn structure for active piece play. Releasing central tension, white opens diagonals for his bishops and prepares to develop his queenside. Reclaiming the center after the exchange solidifies black's pawn structure and opens diagonals for piece development. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating immediate tension and forcing black to react to the doubled pawns on the kingside if they wish to unpin. Solidifying the pawn chain is key here, anchoring the central structure. Securing the queen to support the central pawn and prepare development, a solidifying maneuver in the queen's gambit declined. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn breaks, this natural development anticipates the upcoming pawn structure and aims to join the fight for central influence. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this move prioritizes structural integrity. Developing a knight to its natural square solidifies the center's pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling. Developing the bishop to a central square prepares for kingside castling and supports the pawn structure. Securing the king is a priority, a wise decision to shelter your monarch from any potential central threats as the queenside structures begin to solidify. Preparing to castle kingside and consolidate the queenside, this knight aims for a safer outpost while reinforcing the central pawn structure. Shuttling the rook to the open file strengthens central control and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, clearing the way for the rooks to join the fray. Rerouting the knight to a potentially active square, aiming to free the kingside and perhaps challenge white's central pawn structure indirectly. Bolstering the center and preparing a potential kingside pawn push. This move simultaneously restricts black's bishop on c8 and weakens white's own king's pawn cover. Developing the bishop to a central square improves its scope and readies it for potential attacks on white's kingside. Unlocking the E file opens a new dimension for your rooks, preparing for potential central action. Asserting influence over the crucial c-file solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Sanctifying the king's position by vacating h1 offers invaluable defensive breathing room. Shifting the knight to d7 offers flexibility, potentially reinforcing the central pawns or preparing for a future queenside expansion. Exchanges off a vital defender, simplifying the pawn structure and creating a more open diagonal for the queen. Reclaiming the piece allows black to redeploy the rook, aiming to support central pawn breaks and activate it along the newly opened E file for potential endgame influence. Initiating a knight maneuver to the kingside, aiming to bolster the center and prepare for an offensive advance. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank aims to bolster the queenside defense and potentially prepare for future activity on the open file. Refocusing the queen on the kingside aims to prepare an attack, potentially involving g4 and a pawn storm. The knight redirects to a more active square, preparing for potential queenside operations or a central regrouping to challenge white's bishop pair. Unleashing central pressure, this pawn thrust aims to shatter black's solid structure and seize initiative. Opening the d-file now offers dynamic possibilities, potentially challenging white's central pawn structure. Unleashing the e-file opens lines for your queen and king's rook, creating dynamic attacking potential. The rook's redeployment to the 7th rank prepares for potential counterplay along that open file. Exploiting the open d-file, white bravely sacrifices a pawn for a potent kingside attack and initiative. Embracing the open d-file secures central influence, but don't neglect your queen's safety from this powerful diagonal. Sharpening the attack along the central files, white pressures the isolated pawn and potentially opens lines toward the black king. Sensing the growing pressure on the central pawns, the rook seeks refuge and prepares to double on the semi-open file. Initiating a bold pawn thrust to fracture black's central structure and open vital diagonal avenues for your pieces. This repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses on white's kingside and preparing for piece coordination. Repositioning the bishop to support the d-pawn's advance and potentially eye black's vulnerable queenside structure. Strategically, this maneuver offers no immediate advancement for the rook, potentially allowing white to solidify their central pawns and develop attacking initiative. Sacrificing material for an open queen's attack on the file creates an unbalanced position with tactical possibilities. The rook now eyes open lines, but the pawn structure might become a target. Targeting the weak pawn on b6 with the queen repositions it to a more aggressive square, increasing pressure on black's queenside structure. This knight's foray aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside. Suddenly, the isolated pawn exerts immense pressure, aiming to pry open the queenside and create a dangerous passed weapon. A daring pawn grab, aiming to exploit the seemingly loose queen, but it leaves the king exposed to a coming knight outpost. Steering the knight towards central influence aims to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Initiating a pawn race, black repositions the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and defend their king. Snatching the pawn opens up queenside pawns, inviting active piece play and potentially a queen trade to simplify. Reclaiming central influence, this knight repositions to eye white's weak d6 pawn and potentially disrupt white's queenside ambitions. Material equalizing by removing queens simplifies the position, transitioning towards a complex rook endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. The rook exchange simplifies the position, steering us towards a queenless middle game where piece activity will be paramount. Focusing on active rook placement, this aims to exploit the open d-file and potentially tie down black's kingside. Exchanging rooks simplifies the position, offering a slightly better endgame for black due to active pieces. Repositioning the rook to the open file immediately addresses the central pawn imbalance and reclaims initiative. Unburdening the king from its protective pawn shield now opens a dynamic endgame where maneuvering for central control is paramount. Probing for weaknesses, the pawn advance aims to restrict black's piece mobility and potentially create a passed pawn down the queenside. A daring counterattack, seizing central space and challenging white's imposing piece structure. Clearing the file opens a path for the queen, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement and potentially create weaknesses. Shifting the king to the f-file prepares for the inevitable endgame exchange and potentially activates the monarch. A strategic sacrifice opens lines, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and force piece exchanges. Opening the h-file disrupts black's defensive structure and allows white's remaining pieces more activity. Opening the d-file with the rook now grants white potential pressure on the weakened kingside pawn structure. Initiating knight repositioning, this maneuver aims to challenge the central pawn presence and activate the piece on the queenside. Asserting control over the crucial queenside squares, the knight infiltrates to a commanding outpost, threatening immediate disruption. Recapturing the knight opens a vital diagonal for your bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawns and activate your pieces. Simplifying the endgame, white exchanges rooks to exploit the open d-file and advance the passed pawn. Finally, the queens are off the board, initiating a complex endgame where the knight's maneuverability to the central squares will be paramount. Initiating pawn expansion on the queenside to exploit the open lines and gain space. Reconnecting the knight to the center after the exchange of queens opens avenues for activity on the kingside. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential for a breakthrough, this advance aims to disrupt black's coordination.